The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, Elspeth Vane had lost everything she thought she knew about her father. She was 26 years old, standing in the kitchen of the house she'd grown up in, holding a piece of paper that smelled like dust and old regret. Outside, the Alberta sky was doing what it always did in late October, pressing down low and gray, like it was trying to remind everyone beneath it how small they were. The letter was from a lawyer in Calgary. Short, precise, the kind of language that didn't waste sympathy on the people reading it. Her father, Gordon Vane, had borrowed $43,000 from a man named Rowan Ashby 3 years ago. The ranch, 240 acres outside Pincher Creek, the only thing her family had owned for 4 generations, had been put up as collateral. Gordon Vane had died in June without paying a cent of it back. The debt now fell to the estate. The estate was Elspeth. She set the letter down on the table where her father used to read the paper every morning. She stood there for a long time without moving. The ranch foreman, old Pete Sayers, found her like that an hour later when he came in for coffee. He looked at the letter. He looked at her face. He didn't say anything for a while, which was one of the things she'd always respected about him. "You know this Ashby?" she asked finally. Pete wrapped both hands around his mug. "Know of him, runs cattle up past Waterton. Good operation. Quiet man. Young? Younger than your father was." That was all he said. Elspeth folded the letter back into its envelope, put it in her coat pocket, and went out to look at the land. She walked the fence line the way she had as a child, when her father used to take her out on Sunday mornings before the rest of the world woke up. The grass was brown and frostbitten, the creek running slow and quiet under a skin of ice at the edges. 240 acres. She knew every piece of it. The low spot near the south pasture that flooded every spring. The stand of aspens where her mother had scattered wildflower seeds the summer, before she got sick. The old equipment shed that leaned slightly west, that her father had always meant to fix and never did. She was not going to lose this land. She drove to Calgary 3 days later, found the lawyer's office on a tree-lined street in Beltline, and sat across from a man in a good suit who explained, very patiently, that the terms of the loan allowed Rowan Ashby to call in the full amount now that Gordon Vane had passed. She could pay it back within 90 days, or the property would be transferred. "And if I want to speak to him directly?" Elspeth asked. "To Ashby." The lawyer paused in a way that suggested this wasn't usually how it worked. "I can pass along your contact information. I'd rather have his." He gave it to her. She wasn't sure why he did, but she thought it might have something to do with the way she was sitting, very still, very straight, the kind of stillness that takes effort. She called the number from the parking lot, sitting in her truck with the heat running and dead leaves skidding across the windshield. It rang 4 times. "Ashby." The voice was low, unhurried, the voice of someone who didn't get nervous on the phone. "This is Elspeth Vane," she said. "Gordon Vane's daughter. I think we need to talk." A pause. Not a surprised pause. More like a pause that had been waiting for something. "Yes," he said. "I think we do." They met at a diner outside Claresholm, halfway between their respective directions. She got there first, took a booth near the window, ordered coffee she didn't drink. When Rowan Ashby walked in, she recognized him before he looked around for her, not because she'd seen him before, but because he moved like someone who was used to a lot of space around him. Tall, wide-shouldered, mid-30s, wearing a canvas work jacket with actual wear on the elbows, he spotted her and came directly over. "Miss Vane." He sat down without the performance of a handshake. "Elspeth," she said. "You're Rowan Ashby." "I am." The waitress came. He ordered coffee. They waited until she left. "I'm not here to plead," Elspeth said. "I want to understand what my options are." He looked at her steadily. His eyes were dark brown, the kind of dark that didn't give much away. "Your options are what the agreement says they are. And if I want to renegotiate? Renegotiate how?" She'd thought about this for 3 days. She'd done the numbers 17 different ways. The cattle she could sell would cover maybe 18,000. The equipment, another 6 if she was lucky. She was still 20,000 short, and that was before operating costs for the coming year. She didn't have the money, and there was nobody to borrow it from. Her father had already made sure of that. "I can't pay it back in 90 days, she said. "I can pay it back in 3 years if you let me run the ranch. I'll sign whatever you need. Payment schedule, lien on the cattle, anything." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Outside, a grain truck rumbled past and the windows shuddered faintly in their frames. "Your father came to me with this loan," he said carefully. "He needed it quickly and he didn't want questions. I gave it to him because I knew the land. I knew it was good collateral. You knew my father? We'd met a few times over the years. At sales, mostly." Something about the way he said it made her feel like there was more underneath that sentence, but she didn't push. "I'm not my father," she said. "No," Rowan said. "I can see that." She wasn't sure what to make of that. She pressed on. "The ranch is viable. Pete Sayers has been foreman for 11 years. I grew up on that land. I know how to run it.
All I'm asking is time.
He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. It was a thinking gesture she'd later learn. Something he did when he was deciding something he'd already mostly decided. I'm not trying to take your land, Elspeth, he said. Then let me keep it. He looked at her for a moment in a way that felt uncomfortably direct, not rude, just honest in a way people usually weren't with strangers. I'll give you the 3 years, same interest rate, quarterly payments. I'll need to see your operating plan. She blinked.
She had not expected it to be that simple. That's it?
I'll draw up an amendment to the agreement. My lawyer will send it to yours.
He pushed his barely touched coffee aside and stood up. I hope you're right about the ranch. I am, she said. He left exact change on the table for both coffees.
She sat there after he'd gone and tried to understand what had just happened, and whether she should feel relieved or suspicious. She settled on both. The first quarterly payment was due in March. She made it, barely, by selling 12 head at the Lethbridge auction the week before. She stood in the cold and watched them load into the trailer and felt the particular specific grief of selling animals you'd raised from calves. But she made the number. She transferred the money and got confirmation email from Rowan's lawyer that was exactly as impersonal as the first letter had been. In April, a water line burst in the old pump house, and Pete discovered it at 5 in the morning and called her, and they spent 6 hours in the mud fixing it before the pasture flooded. She was filthy and exhausted and furious by noon. She drove to the co-op for parts and ran into Doris Hetrick from the next place over, who told her, without much preamble, that she'd heard the Vane ranch was in trouble. "Where'd you hear that?" Elspeth asked. Doris shrugged in particular ways of small-town people who've already said too much. People talk. Elspeth bought her parts and drove home. She didn't think about what people were saying. She had too much else to think about. She didn't see Rowan Ashby again until June, when she drove past his gate on the way back from Waterton, and, on an impulse she couldn't fully explain, turned in. His operation was larger than she'd expected, the kind of organized, well-maintained spread that told you immediately that the person running it paid attention to details. The yard was clean, the equipment under cover, the fence lines straight. A dog came out to greet her truck, some kind of shepherd mix, tail up and curious. Rowan came out of the barn when she knocked on the side door. He had grease on his forearm and was wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at her without apparent surprise.
"Elspeth," he said. "I was passing," she said, which they both knew wasn't quite true. "You didn't pass his place on the way to anywhere in particular."
"I wanted to tell you in person. The first 2 payments are done and the third will be on time. I wanted you to know the plan is holding." He studied her for a moment.
"I assumed it was," he said. "I would have heard otherwise. I know, I still wanted to say it." He tilted his head slightly. "You drove 40 minutes to tell me that." "Yes." He almost smiled. It was a restrained thing, barely a shift in his expression, but she caught it. "Do you want to see the place?" She hadn't expected that. "If you're not busy." "I'm always busy," he said. "Come anyway." He showed her around in the easy way of someone who was proud of what they'd built without needing to announce it. The cow-calf operation was smaller than hers but tighter. He'd put in a new calving barn the year before, with good lighting and proper heating that made a visible difference in the outcomes. She asked questions because she genuinely wanted to know the answers, and he answered them without making her feel like questions were a nuisance. They ended up leaning on the top rail of the south corral in the long evening light, watching a handful of yearlings move around the pen in that directionless, half-interested way of young cattle. "My father," she said eventually. "Did you know him well?" Rowan considered the question. Not well. Well enough to know he was proud. Too proud to ask his daughter for help. Maybe. "I found out about the loan from a letter," she said. "After he died, he never told me." She'd said this out loud to exactly no one since June, and she wasn't sure why she was saying it now. Maybe because Rowan was the only other person who knew the whole shape of the situation. "That must have been hard," he said, without overdoing it. "It was." She watched the yearlings. "It still is, sometimes." He didn't try to fix that. She appreciated it. She drove home in the early dark and thought about the way he'd said her name when she pulled into the yard, no surprise in it, like he'd been expecting her. She thought about it longer than was probably useful. In August, there was a problem. One of the neighboring landowners, a man named Boyd Crispin, who'd had his eye on the south pasture for years, discovered through some route she was never quite able to trace exactly that the ranch was operating under a debt arrangement. He approached her at the Pincher Creek Farmers Market with the confidence of someone who believed he was doing her a favor. "I could take the South 40 off your hands," he said. "Give you a fair price. Help you clear some of that debt." She smiled at him in the way that didn't reach anything above the mouth. "The South 40 isn't for sale, Boyd. Be reasonable, Elspeth." A young woman running a place that size alone. "I'm not alone," she said. "I have Pete, and the place isn't in trouble. Thank you for the offer.
She walked away before he could respond. That night, she called Rowan. She wasn't entirely sure why she called him specifically, whether it was because he was the person she needed to update or the person she wanted to talk to. She was starting to suspect those two things had quietly become the same person without her noticing. She told him about Boyd Crispin's approach. He listened without interrupting. Do you want me to make it clear the arrangement is private? He asked.
Can you do that? I can make a phone call.
Nothing aggressive.
Just clarifying. I don't want you to fight my battles.
It's not your battle, he said. It's a boundary around a private financial agreement. That's mine to enforce too. She thought about that.
All right, she said. If you're willing, I am.
She was quiet for a moment. Outside her kitchen window, the yard light was on, and moths were circling it in slow orbits.
Rowan, she said. Yes, why did you agree to the renegotiation so quickly?
In the diner. You didn't ask for anything. You barely asked any questions. A pause. Longer than his usual pauses.
I knew the land, he said. I told you that. That's not a reason to trust a person. Another pause. No, he said. It isn't.
He didn't say anything more, and she didn't push, but she lay awake for a long time afterward, turning the non-answer over, looking at it from different angles, the way you turn a stone you've found in a field, not sure yet what you're holding, but certain that it matters. October again. 12 months since the letter. She'd made every payment. The ranch was leaner than it had been under her father, more carefully managed. The books balanced in a way they hadn't been in years. She'd sold the old truck and bought a used one that actually started in cold weather. She'd fixed the equipment shed. She hadn't sold the South 40.
Rowan had started stopping by, not regularly.
Not with any stated reason, but every few weeks he'd appear in the yard with some excuse that was obviously not the real reason. A piece of equipment she might want to borrow, a question about the water source on the east side of her property. Once, a jar of honey from his neighbor's bees, which was so plainly not an errand that she almost laughed. She didn't laugh. She thanked him and made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, talking about things that had nothing to do with debt or cattle or property lines. And when he left, she stood at the window and watched his truck until it was gone. She asked Pete about it, obliquely, one morning when they were checking the fence on the north end.
You know Rowan Ashby well,
she said. Pete thought about it with his usual unhurriedness.
Seen him around for years. He came to your father's funeral, actually. Didn't stay long. Stood in the back. She hadn't known that. She'd been too broken that day to register faces. Did my father know him better than he let on? She asked.
Pete shrugged. Your dad knew a lot of people better than he let on. She left it there, but it sat with her. The funeral. Standing in the back. The way Rowan had given her 3 years without hesitation, and the way his pauses got longer when she asked him direct questions about why. She drove to his place on a Wednesday, this time without pretending it was in passing. He was in the yard when she pulled up, unhitching a trailer. He turned when he heard her truck, and something in his face shifted in a way she was learning to read, a slight settling, like something in him slowed down.
I have a question, she said, getting out. Ask it. You came to my father's funeral. His expression stayed even. Yes, why? He looked at her for a moment, then looked away at the middle distance, at the Rockies sitting pale blue and cold on the western horizon. Because he was a man I knew, and he died, he said. People go to funerals. Pete said you stood in the back and left early. I didn't know many people there, Rowan. She said it the way she would say stop to a horse going sideways. He was quiet.
A magpie landed on the fence post 20 feet away and observed them both.
I met you before, he said finally. Before the letter. Before your father came to me for the loan. She went still.
At the Nanton auction, he said.
3 years before your father died. You were there buying a pair of quarter horses. You argued down the price on the second one by pointing out a compensated gate that the seller hadn't disclosed. Everyone in the ring heard you. You were right, and you knew you were right, and you didn't apologize for knowing it.
He paused. I didn't speak to you. We were on opposite sides of the ring, and then you were gone.
But I remembered it.
Elspeth stood very still in the October cold and tried to arrange her thoughts into something orderly.
When my father came to you, she said slowly, I recognized the name. He turned to look at her directly. I didn't know if you still had any connection to the ranch. I should have asked. I didn't, because I didn't want it to matter. But it did. Yes.
She looked at him. All the small things she'd been assembling without quite meaning to. The phone calls, the jars of honey, the pauses clicked into a shape she recognized. You could have found a reason to reach out, she said, in 3 years, before the letter, but you didn't. No. He met her eyes. I told myself I was respecting a boundary that wasn't really mine to draw. I was a stranger who happened to remember a woman from an auction. That's not a reason to call someone. It might have been, she said quietly. The magpie flew off. The wind moved through the grass at the edge of the yard, the dry sound of late autumn. I'm telling you now, he said. That's what I'm doing. If it's too strange, or too late, or too complicated, it's not too late, she said. He looked at her carefully, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand properly before acting. She was learning that about him, that he was slow and deliberate in a way that was nothing like hesitation, more like the care of someone who understood that the wrong step in the wrong place could do damage that lasted.
All right, he said. All right, she agreed.
They stood there in the cold for another moment, and then she said, I'll stay for coffee if you're offering, and he said, I'm offering, and they went inside. The third payment landed in January, 18 months into the agreement. By then she knew the sound of his truck from the road without looking up. By then he knew she took her coffee without sugar and that she hated the phone, but would talk on it for an hour without noticing if the subject interested her. By then Pete Sayers, who had seen everything and said very little, had started leaving 2 cups set out on the counter when Rowan's truck appeared in the yard. She made every payment on schedule. The South 40 stayed hers. The aspens her mother had planted were still there on the east side, and in spring they came back the way aspens do, not from seed but from the roots. Everything connected underground, the new growth drawing on the same deep system that had always been there, just waiting. On the morning she made the final payment, 3 years after a letter had arrived. Smelling of dust and old regret, Rowan drove out to the ranch before she'd even had her first cup of coffee. He came in through the kitchen door the way he'd been coming for 2 years, knocked once and didn't wait, and set a manila envelope on the table. She looked at it.
What is this?
The amended agreement, he said. Signed off. The debt's cleared.
The liens released.
He paused.
The land is yours. She opened the envelope, looked at the papers inside, looked back at him. You drove out here to hand-deliver this, she said.
I wanted to be here when you saw it. She looked at the papers again. She thought about the letter that had come on a Tuesday, and the diner outside Claresholm, and the auction ring in Nanton where she hadn't known she was being remembered. She thought about 240 acres of Alberta ground, frostbitten and stubborn and hers, 4 generations deep. She set the papers down on the table her father used to read it every morning.
Stay for breakfast, she said.
Rowan sat down at the kitchen table, and Elspeth Vane made coffee for 2, and outside the window the Alberta light was coming up slow and gold and certain, the way it always did, the way it would keep doing long after both of them were gone. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt the particular quiet of a morning with nothing chasing it.